Blessings, everyone, and welcome back. I'm astrologer Elsa Wadsworth. I'm here today with Matt Nolan from the Astrologer's Encyclopedia. Hey, Matt.
Hello.
So we are here with chapter 93 of Demetra George, Ancient Astrology, and we are on the Master of the Nativity, or the Oikodespotes, or the Oikodespotes Geneseos. Am I getting that somewhat?
Geneseos.
Geneseos, thank you.
I
Which kind
think.
of right. No, you're probably much better at this. I always get nervous about saying the Greek when we're recording. Okay, so the Oikodespotes denotes a ruler, like a domicile ruler. So when we're talking about Venus and Taurus, we're talking about the Oikodespotes, the ruler of Taurus, Venus, right? But when we give it this Genesis kind of name, we're talking about it as the master of the nativity. So as Demetra goes through the book in this chapter, she just says that the Oikodespotes, in this case, we're just talking about the big one, the overall sort of ruler of the nativity in this way. So when we are talking about the ruler of nativity or the master of the nativity, it is going to be connected with last chapter or last video on ancient astrology, chapters 92 and maybe even 90, where we're talking about the predominator. So if you want to go back and watch that, if you haven't watched that yet, these are going to be linked, and we are going to be giving examples today like we did last time to try to make it a little easier. Demetra likens this search for the Oikodespotes to the search for the fountain of youth. So it is a search, just like we experienced with the predominator. It talks about the vital times of men or the number of years of life, but it also has to do with overall management or upkeep of the chart as a whole, almost like the whole chart is the home of the native, or it's like a kind of full scope for the native. It can mean like the ruler of a city-state, and we'll talk a little bit more towards the end of the video how this also talks about the body, the character, and things like that. So it's like a sort of overall chart, not dispositor, but kind of significator in a sense. Do you have stuff that you want to add, Matt, before we jump into the examples?
So basically, just kind of reiterating what you already said, is that what we're looking for here, this Oikodespotes, is Demetra says on 1066 that it is the host of the life force that is embodied in the lights. So we always want to think about this with like sign rulership, and then in terms of this technique, is that when we have, for example, like you're saying, a planet in Taurus, it's Venus's job to host that planet. She can be a good host if she's like witnessing by trine and in good condition. She can be like a begrudging host if she's witnessing by square or opposition, or she can be like a completely negligent host if she's in aversion or is in really bad condition or something like that. And so what we're looking for here is a planet that will host the life force, hopefully in a good way, in a way that will grant many years, in a way that will grant, long health, longevity, vigorousness, all these kinds of things. Yeah.
High
Yeah.
regard in people, maybe
Mm-hmm.
their beauty and appearance or something like
Mm-hmm.
this, where you're favored in
Yeah.
these ways.
And like just later in the chapter, and we'll kind of get to this again after we talk about how to do it, is when we're talking about like if the Oikodespotes is really well placed, it'll be, as Elsa was saying, you'll be favored by people, popular, attractive, whatever, all these kinds of things. But let's say it's like Jupiter is the Oikodespotes, but it's in bad condition. People will be, according to, I think this is from Toiker, people will be envious of you. You'll be regarded with jealousy for your, Jupiterian significations, whatever.
Same with Venus.
Yeah.
Tusser and the rest of them, they give throughout the chapter. I mean, if we're not doing a promo of the book, I don't know what we're doing, but as we go through, and we'll go over this in our study group, again, these are sort of teasers for like a more thorough treatment that we give in our Patreon study group. So if you want to join for the rest of the book, there's a few more chapters left. They're heady, they're concentrated, so it would be a great time to jump on board, even if these have been sufficient up until now, if you want to dig into the heart of some of these things. But there's actually quite a bit of early authorship that goes into even delineating these positions and talking about, like, we have really early authors talking about it, and then we have like Valance and the rest of them. So there's, throughout the chapter, there is a lot of quotes and what do you want to call it when you have the asterisk and it refers you to the author? What do you call that?
Notes.
Yeah, I guess.
Notes. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of footnotes and author notes, like giving us source material for this. So we are going to go through that in the study group as well. Like, we'll probably bring up Firmicus Maternus, read some passages, Valance, read some passages, as well as, you know, a lot of Tusser in here. So that being said, we probably won't cover it all in this video, but it is super interesting. And we do have a lot of like hearty delineations from some of the early authors in this chapter. So thank you, Demetra. With that being said, should we go through the examples?
Sure. Yeah, so I've made a little slideshow. The same thing that I did last month, just talking about the different authors and their different methods for finding the master of the nativity. A lot of times it will be, or every time I think, it will be based on the predominator that you've already found. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through each author with an example chart. I've worked out what the predominators are for each author. And then we will, based on what we've already found, find the master of the nativity.
Yeah, and I'm probably repeating exactly what Matt just said, but if you haven't already, go back and watch the last video on the predominator. You'll get like 5 methods of finding the predominator. Find all 5. They might be different, and go ahead and do that same thing. Take your 5 predominators, and then today find the master of the nativity for all 5 that you found. It's not that much work. It sounds like a lot, but it's not that much. And for people like Porphyry, we're going to have maybe 2 options for the master of the nativity. So you might have one of the predominators that follows with like 2 Oikodespotes, but go ahead and just start writing that out. Just get a feel for the technique, and a few charts are in your own chart. Okay, so we've calculated the predominator, and now we're going to show the master of the nativity with those predominators.
So starting with the Porphyry method, which in the previous chapter, I think was the Porphyry/Antiochus method. The Oikodespotes is very simply the domicile lord of the predominator. And she also says that the bound lord of the predominator is sort of like a co-master. And so what she says basically is that Porphyry kind of sidesteps some of the messiness by mentioning that, you know, in other versions of this technique, the bound lord is super important, but here we're just going to make it like a co-ruler. And these planets do not necessarily need to witness the predominator in order to be like confirmed, as in some other cases. But he does say to examine the relationship between the 2 planets that we've chosen, as well as their relationships specifically to the ascendant and to the moon. And so in this method, because of how the Porphyry Antiochus predominator search goes, you're always going to end up with either the sun, the moon, or the ascendant. So remember, before we were saying that this is a planet that's going to host sort of the power of the lights, or in this case, possibly also the ascendant. So for this chart, the ascendant is the predominator by the Porphyry method, because if you remember, it has to be like a light that is preferably upsect in like the 1st, 11th, or 10th. That clearly is not the case here, so you just default to the ascendant. And so in this case, we would have Saturn being the
lord,
the domicile lord of the predominator, and then the bound lord would be Venus. So Saturn and Venus would be sort of co-masters of the nativity.
And here they can see each other, and they're in a friendly but weak aspect, but it is by so.
Yep. And then they're also co-present with the moon, so you would probably judge this to be, you know, good, relatively. I think ideally Venus is nice. Venus is in the first with a nice sextile to the moon. The moon is in her bound. So Venus is like the stronger of the two. Ideally, I think you really do want it to be like angular.
You also really want it to be of sect. So I think we'll get to that as we go, but let's just note it here that Venus is extra good here. Not only is she being ruled by Saturn and she can see Saturn from a superior aspect, but she's applying, right? But also she's of the sect in favor where, Matt already noted earlier, let's say like Jupiter in a night chart, not as good. Venus in a day chart, not as good. So here in a night chart, Venus would be, getting some of her favorable delineations.
Yeah. So that's the Porphyry method. It's probably the simplest. Maybe Firmicus is even simpler. We notably don't have a Dorotheus method outlined here, which I think is interesting and a little frustrating because I really liked his predominator method. But so skipping over Dorotheus and coming to Valance, the Oikodespotes is the bound lord of the predominator. And the predominator, when I say this is, I mean the predominator is always going to be either the sun, the moon, the ascendant, or the midheaven. And so in this case, in this chart, it is the midheaven. There's a table in the last chapter on the predominator that will help you figure out through Valance's method what your predominator is. But without going into that, we land at the midheaven here. So we find the bound lord of the midheaven, which is going to be Jupiter. And if this planet is not witnessed by the predominator, or in this case does not witness the predominator, or is setting on the descendant, the chart has no Oikodespotes. So in this case, Jupiter is aspecting the midheaven. So we can sort of confirm it as a candidate for the Oikodespotes. And she goes into this little tangent about how it's not necessarily sort of the end of the game if you still want to do length of life, and Valance says you don't have an Oikodespotes. It is probably worth thinking like what kind of life, she says, doesn't have a housemaster. Does it mean that it's more disorganized? Does it mean that it's potentially more brittle or like in danger if it has less of like a solid command over it?
And I love that she addresses that here because we did talk about it a little bit in last episode or last month's video on the Ancient Astrology book, where we were saying, okay, so let's say you have the predominator, 5 different predominators, or you have a very weak aspect, seeing as how if you would need an aspect in that technique, you have a weak aspect or no aspect. Like, what would that say philosophically about the life? What would it say about trying to use the technique there, the length of life one? What would it say about the character and their sort of auspiciousness or their sort of claim to fame or something like this, the vitality of the life and spirit, let's say. So we already were kind of pondering a little bit like, what could it mean if we don't have a strong one, or if we don't have one at all, or if we have 5 different ones? So I like that she wrote here a little bit about that and how that was potentially her train of thinking or something we could consider. So I felt I like that.
Good. Yeah. And so, like my thinking sort of is going like, a lot of times what we're going to be doing with these, once we have the Oikodespotes, is we're going to be sort of progressing it to find when it hits hard aspects with malefics or, other quote unquote bad conditions. And so part of me is wondering like, okay, let's say you have like a of sect, super angular, exalted Oikodespotes, maybe it can endure, harder hits from malefics or something like that versus a planet that's a little bit weaker, perhaps cadent, fallen, all these kinds of things.
Yeah, let's say you have also a predominator that's you're getting your sect light every time. Like you have a really strong sect light, and then its bounds or its, master of the nativity is also strong insect by trine or something like this. Maybe we can say they have more eminence or just a hardier constitution or hardier maybe role or mission or something like this.
So back to the Valance method, if you find that the bound lord of the predominator that you found does not have an aspect with the predominator, it means you do not have an Oikodespotes, not necessarily, again, a reason to like panic. There are other ways that we can still get to the same answer, which with these last couple of months has been length of life is sort of what we're looking for with this.
You also have all the other authors, so you can just be like, okay,
Yeah. So Paulus now is telling us to choose one of the 4 zodiacal rulers, those being domicile, exaltation, trigon, or bound of the predominator. And so she's not entirely clear on like specifically how to choose it. So for Paulus in this case, in this chart, we're going to be taking the lot of fortune as the predominator. So that is in the first. So we have it in Saturn sign. There's no exaltation. It's in the trigon of Mercury, I believe, in a night chart, right? In an air sign?
Yes.
Yeah. And then Venus is the bound ruler. So you would essentially look for what is the strongest of these rulers, but you would put a lot of consideration on like if one planet has more than one mode of rulership. So like, let's say, for example, that the lot of fortune was here in Saturn's sign, and in Saturn's bounds, you would probably just say, okay, Saturn has the most authority over this planet, regardless kind of how he's placed. But in this case, I would probably say that Venus would be the Oikodespotes because she's simply in the best condition. Saturn is fallen and cadent. Mercury is cadent, retrograde, and applying to Saturn. Venus is in the first of sect, of the 3, definitely the strongest. He also says that it's important to witness the predominator, but it does not seem essential as it was in Valance's method to confirm it. So like, let's just pretend here that Venus somehow didn't witness a lot of fortune. That wouldn't necessarily be like a no-go for it, but it like heightens the condition if they are sort of have a line of communication.
Yeah, and I really like that some of these authors are actually stressing like all the other things that we know about astrology, right? So they're just saying like assess the best one here, or assess the one that has the most dignity, that seems to be the strongest, that has the most going for it. And so I thought that's interesting, right? Because some of them are just like a certain set of rules and it's just like 1, 2, or 3, A, B, or C. But here you're kind of counting up the ideal scenario for the planet and factoring that into your judgment, which is interesting.
Yeah. And again, what we're really looking for here is like, who's going to be the best host? In this case, is it going to be Venus because she's, vigorous in the first, of sect, all this, or is it going to be like cranky old Saturn down in Aries who's cadent, right? Saturn is probably not going to have the energy or the time or the will, whatever, to take care of a lot of fortune here, where Venus probably would. So that's kind of just what we're thinking about here, is who's going to be the best host for like the source of life in this nativity. So Firmicus probably actually has the easiest one. You just take the domicile lord of the sign following the natal moon, but you exclude Cancer and Leo. So you cannot have the light kind of hosting itself, which I think is really interesting. And choosing the natal moon, I think, is also interesting because it sort of grounds this technique in the body, and like how strong is the body, how vigorous is the body, how long will the body last, right?
The look, the mind,
yep.
also.
And so an example of like when you would skip over Cancer and Leo is pretty much if the natal moon is in Gemini, you would go to the next sign, Cancer, can't do that. Next sign, Leo, can't do that. Next sign, Virgo, then Mercury would be the Oikodespotes. But in this chart, we have the moon in Aries. We would jump to Taurus and say Venus is the Oikodespotes. So this is now like 3 charts with Venus, I think. So in this chart, it's looking like Venus is probably a good candidate, right? And really, so this is, sorry.
Really prominent, yeah. As well as you also have a lot of fortune there, a lot of spirit there. It's in the first house, already representing the native in that sense. So it has a lot going for it as being an option, a choice.
Yeah. So the final one is Ptolemy, and she doesn't really say what Ptolemy's technique is. She kind of just says like he doesn't look for just one, he looks for several. And this is just a quote. I forgot to close the parentheses. On 1069 says he being Ptolemy, presented a method of releasing from the ascendant 4 events relating to the body and journeys abroad, from the lot of fortune for matters of property, from the moon for affections of the soul and for marriage, from the sun for dignities and glory, and from the midheaven for other matters such as actions, friendships, and the begetting of children. So I do wish she had gone into a little more detail on those, but I do like that she's sort of presenting, another way of thinking of this as, we don't necessarily need one planet to handle all the matters of life. We might actually want to break up that responsibility between planets.
Which
and
again,
that's sort of what Ptolemy does.
Yeah, and it again shows kind of like, as we move through to quote unquote like later authors, I guess, which I don't know if you can really consider Ptolemy like late in the tradition, but we see more and more reliance on sort of the astrological technique, right? That we already know. Casting lots, looking at certain planets for certain things, their qualities and their natural dispositions or something like that.
Yeah, and Ptolemy is kind of idiosyncratic in a number of things. And so this is just another example where he is sort of singular. But very, very interesting. And I would love to go back and read Ptolemy for that technique.
Yeah, and I'd like to read all the authors and what they say, because I'd like to go in and read Dorotheus if I can get it together before, I think I will be able to before our study group, because, and maybe Dorotheus just doesn't say, and that's why probably she doesn't include it. But I would say whatever, I mean, I did this is just me, so this is unorthodox, okay? But whatever Dorotheus does prescribe for your predominator, check out the Bound Lord. Because we know that this is sect is important, but we can't use the lights. Everyone's using the bounds in different ways. So check out Dorotheus's predominator, check out the Bound Lord, apply some of these compilations of thought to that planet, and just see what Dorotheus has to say, with keeping what the rest of the authors have to say in mind, just what he may have been doing. So I definitely did look at the Bound Lord of my Dorotheus predominator.
Yeah. And I really like this focus on the Bound Lord, because it's kind of like a very immediate form of authority compared to the sign, where we were talking the other day, where it's the bound ruler is the teacher's classroom in a school, or it's the apartment within the apartment building. And so if we're looking for who's going to be the best host for the sun, it's the closest, most direct form of authority over the sun or the moon or ascendant or whoever is going to have a great amount of effect. Another way that we might think of the Bound Lord is I think it's in Schmidt, he says it's the manner that the planet is judged. So it'll be if a planet's in Saturn's bounds, it's judged harshly. If it's in Mars's bounds, it's judged strictly. I think I have that flipped, actually. Jupiter, it's judged justly. Venus, it's judged leniently. And Mercury, I think, is shrewdly. So you can think of what are the conditions of success for this planet? What kind of game is it playing? Is it, trying to do its thing and reporting to Saturn to say, Saturn, how did I do? And Saturn says, did you follow the narrow little path that I set out? Jupiter is going to be hey, I gave you all of these options and all these opportunities. Did you take them? Right. So you can think of that as well.
Can you remember the author when we were having this conversation? I was quoting an author. Now I'm forgetting, but someone was talking about it as, I use the apartment thing, but a secret domicile within the domicile. So you have you have the sign, right? The overall domicile master is Venus in Taurus or whatever. So then in Venus, the land of Venus, right? In that in the homescape of Venus, you have a secret apartment or a small abode within her space that's sort of yours, that has the characteristic, or you have the lock and key in order to set, your room in her home, which is okay, I live in a Venus place, but I have a small little apartment, a little corridor for myself. So I think that's also an interesting, it's similar to what you said, but it's a little, you can use it as a judgment, or you can use it almost as a refuge, or delineation of like the two. So you're in a Venus land, but you have a small little Saturnine apartment within the Venus land. So yeah, it's interesting. Bound lords are interesting in a lot of different ways. And just in case people were wondering, we use the Egyptian bounds. So
yeah, and you know, like maybe just one last way to think of it is like every house that you go into, for the most part, like let's say we're in, you know, the US, most houses are going to have like a living room, a kitchen, a couple of bedrooms, some bathrooms, maybe a basement, whatever. We can think of the different rooms almost again as like the bounds, where like the kitchen where it's really hot might be more like Mars, the bedroom where it's super comfortable might be more like Venus, right? The moon and sun don't have bounds, where Jupiter might be, I don't know, a room where
library.
a library, yeah, or like Mercury's bounds might be the library, Jupiter's like the living room or something like that. So you can think of it as the planet is, you know, how would you act in the kitchen versus the living room versus the bedroom
versus the basement, which is
versus the basement, which is Saturn.
Okay. Cool. So now we've got this, I wanted to get this Petasiris quote in here that Matt said that they would read for us. So we've got the global role of the Oikodespotes, in this case, the master of the Nativity, not the domicile lord. And I thought it was cool that Valance included this passage from Petasiris. It's not necessarily cryptic, but it gives, I think, an idea of what we're looking for. It's not poetic or cryptic, but it's also not a prescription of how to find it. It's more of a detail on what that we think that it is. And as we know, like Petasiris is one of our very, very earliest Hermes-like sources, right? So would you mind reading that for us, Matt?
Absolutely. So this is on page 1069. And this is like really one of my favorite parts of Valance. Like I heard Chris Brennan say this forever ago, and then I read Valance and I was like, this is hilarious. Is that he's always complaining about Nichepso and Petasiris. He's like, these guys are really annoying because they don't make any sense. Like I have no idea what they're saying. And so you can kind of see that in this quote. He says, beginning and dominion over all the places under examination, the star according to each nativity that is the Oikodespotes, which makes clear beforehand for the children which ones will have life and what kind of support they will have for it, what kind of character they will have in the form of their body. All of this follows from this star, and without this star, there is nothing, neither action nor reputation that exists for anyone. So again, it's like almost kind of funny that he's, you know, saying so little in so many words, but basically this star, its condition will determine a great deal about life. A lot of actions will spring forth from this star. The native's character, their appearance will sort of be radiated by this star.
Yeah, defined by it, or nothing exists for anyone without it. So if you can't find yours, good luck.
Yeah, right. Right. And then Valance goes ahead and says, well, some people don't have it. So
that's in the anthology, chapter 2, 41 through like whatever. So you can find it if you want in Valance, and read more about it. Let's see, what else do we want to include?
So maybe just kind of in terms of like this global role, she does say, like, very next page at the top says the Oikodespotes has two clear-cut roles as the master of the nativity, which we've already kind of gone through this, but the first is denoting the years of life, and the second is in shaping the character, constitution, and appearance of the individual. And so there's another passage down at the bottom of 1070 from Tusser of Babylon, where she says, or he says, when Jupiter receives the rulership of the nativity upon an angle by day and operates in its own domicile or that of a sectmate, it indicates important and notable persons, acceptable, revered, good, open-hearted, high-minded, those who accomplish matters beyond the power of cities or the common people, those who are received by kings and other great people, well-spoken because of their virtue and piety, those who prepare honors of sacred offerings, affectionate towards family and beneficent to friends, and who delight in their wives and children, unless Jupiter occurs upon the setting angle, for then they are not blessed with children in this way. So essentially what he's saying here is if Jupiter receives sort of the responsibility of being the Oikodespotes and is in good condition, you get good Jupiter outcomes in terms of your character and your life, right?
And he goes on, like on and on, which I think is awesome, that Tusser, who's also a very early source, gives so much actual delineation about like what to look for, but we get also the philosophy behind it is, and sect has a lot to do with it. They really say if it's out of sect, it's going to get some of its more negative or just kind of like polluted maybe or corrupted significations, where if it's like in a day chart, it's going to be great. If it's at an angle, even better, you know, on and on with the dignities up from there. But Tusser goes on and gives a lot of descriptions, and then Firmicus goes on and gives a lot of descriptions. And what I thought was interesting though, or maybe sad for some, is that she goes on to say, you know, it suggests, or maybe that the benefics lessen their good when they're contrary to sect, but the malefics, when belonging to their sect, still have the ability to be harmful. So that's kind of a bummer because we don't necessarily see the malefics being like, well, if Saturn's in a day chart, it's like all these things. Yes, you'll get some of those great significations, but also when delineating some of the Mars-like constitutions, even in a night chart, we're getting some of the wouldn't so much love it. So
and so it's kind of like everything else where it's like once you know what the planet is, like just delineate it. It's we know the rules for how to do that. It's like a little bit different. You might want to tweak things a little bit, but it's pretty much just basic astrology once you've found the planet.
Yeah, and just remember, Tusser, of course, early author, does say that aspect configurations to the Oikodespotes will modify the judgment. So after you've gone through the natural signification and all of the dignities and angularity, things like this, sect, everyone says sect, which is so important because we want it to be the lights, right? We want the predominator to be the lights. We want sect to be super strong and important in the picking of the predominator. We also want it here in the Oikodespotes. Sect is really important, but yet we skip over the lights, or we don't use the lights themselves within this bound Lord situation of the Oikodespotes. We actually have it be a planet, which I think is interesting because they're almost more like of a distributor and like, or like a distributor serving the light,
like an administrator kind of.
I find that interesting. But don't go crazy. Make sure that you modify your judgment through aspect configuration.
And I really love the if we think of aspects like as being like in a court, right? And so I'm just going to finish this Tusser quote, if that's okay.
Of the Jupiter.
Jupiter, on 1071 says, if Jupiter is greatly damaged by destructive stars striking its beneficence, so Mars or Saturn square or opposite, in a manner similar to others, they have much less power for generosity, and their advancements will be regarded with jealousy. I think that's a really interesting thing. And Jupiter itself has similar significations in accordance with itself. Whatever configurations it makes with other stars will be set in what follows. So what he means by that is that if Jupiter is aspecting another star, it will sort of aid it in a Jupiterian fashion. So if we think of this as like in a courtroom, if we're putting this planet on trial, like this is a way that I always think of reading charts. And we have like a really powerful witness for the prosecution, right? And this witness is saying like, you're bad, you did this evil thing, you're not going to be able to do what you're going to do. That planet is going to be stricken with accusations, jealousy, envy, violence, right? Despite its best intentions.
Even false accusations.
Yeah. So it's like Jupiter's going to be trying his best, but then Mars is over there like heckling him, right? And so whatever Jupiter tries to do is going to carry this, like Elsie, you said, it's almost like polluted, like it's going to come along with these, accusations, really, if it's Mars, or jealousy, all these kinds of things.
And we get this also from Schmidt, in which talk is it? It is the idiom talk, perhaps, where he gives the courtroom analogy of like how to look at the bounds, how to look at when someone's really testifying, and we use it, the testification, like to testify all the time in our language, but it is a really good analysis, like thinking of it as like a courtroom analysis, like who's arguing for, who's arguing against, what accusations do you have to contend with. And she goes on to give a Venus delineation, and it's also this way. It also says, you know, Venus in a night chart is going to be like wearing gold jewelry, you know, making witty, cleanly, industrious, religious. But even just putting it contrary to sect lessens the beneficence, and they can be regarded with jealousy or hatred. So it's like you still might be like beautiful or dripping in gold or whatever it is, but instead of being like, oh, you know, you're pious and beautiful, everyone's going to be covetous or jealous or slanderous against like what you have. So you still might be granted with the things, but it comes with a certain burden of like jealousy or slander or something like that.
Yeah, and we can probably wrap up in a moment, but I think this is a really good way to think of like real life outcomes of significations, because it's really easy to just be like, okay, if a planet's out of sect, it's like not as good. Like, okay, how? Right? It will be, you know, less well received. Like I think that's always a really good thing. Like reductions in planetary condition a lot of times result in, like, if you're trying to do a Venus type of thing, like dress up nice, put gold on, you know, all these kinds of things, how will that be received by fortune being other people, circumstances, events. And if Venus is in really bad condition, things will backfire. You will receive jealousy, hatred, you know, all those kinds of things.
It is important, because it's important to think about, because let's say you even have a well-dignified planet or a pretty good planet, but it's out of sect, you may still, and this isn't the only situation and where you may still get granted some of those benefits. Like you don't have to say like, oh no, I won't get the benefits. You still may get the benefits, but people might not like you for it, i.e. haters or something, right? They might, instead of being like, oh, she's so beautiful, oh, that girl tries too hard or whatever it is.
Right. Like I think Schmidt talks about like begrudgingness, like they grant their significations begrudgingly. So it might be like, oh yeah, like she's really pretty, but
or like, yeah, he's really smart, Jupiter or Mercury or something. Like, yeah, he's a really good lawyer, but he's this, and this.
He's kind of annoying, right? He like shoves it in my face or something. Yeah.
Something like that, where you have it, you're still granted the thing, but it's actually a nuisance to you, which we see all the time, right? I get this thing, but I'm, you know, considered wealthy and privileged in like a negative way or something like this. So yeah, good to keep in mind. So we still get to do chart analysis here, even when we are looking for like technique heavy things like this, we're still using analysis. So keep that in mind. All right, you all, this has been an awesome little episode. Thanks, Matt, for being back.
Thank you.
And make sure to join us for our next study group. And this is just a reminder for the people that are Patreons that are listening to these, because our patrons also still listen to these like freebies to get themselves ready or whatever. We are now meeting, and if you are considering being a part of our study group for the rest of the year, we've been meeting on Wednesdays for the last, year and a half. We have to meet on Mondays for the rest of the year. So we will be meeting the last Monday of every month throughout the rest of the year. So if that changes things for you and opens up your schedule, feel free to join us. And with that being said, thanks for joining for the Master of the Nativity, and we will see you next time. Ciao.
Matao kakao sama yo na mekana soba da soma kena mataiba nakao di ma na mekana soba and soba ataiba na ke auto no ba ikana kamai